Hello, everyone. Welcome to your weekly Legislative Headlines, a special program of the Utah League of Cities and Towns, updating you on what's important on Capitol Hill to the cities and towns of Utah. I'm Terry Wood, filling in for Susan Wood, the Director of Communications for the League. She has a bit of laryngitis, so I'll be the surrogate voice this week. And joining me is Lincoln Schertz, the Director of Legislative Affairs for the League. And Lincoln, you've been spending a lot of time at the Capitol. We're halfway through the legislative session now. Tell us what's important to the cities, what they've enacted recently, and what's at work.
Absolutely. Halfway through the session, the big thing is the budget. The legislature's starting to really dive into the budget. Appropriations committees, which are the committees that look as to how the state's going to spend money, have finalized their work late this week, and we'll take it to the larger Executive Appropriations Committee early next week to see where the state's going to go with its budget, where the priorities are, and this is really where the rubber meets the roads on how we're going to spend $12.5 billion this year. So that's the big news this week. There's a lot of stuff going on for cities and towns as well on policy issues outside of the budget. So a very, very busy time of year.
And the budget's the one that usually comes right down to almost midnight on the last day of the session. There's some other specific issues, as you mentioned, pawn shops, for instance.
Absolutely. I've been working on a pawn shops piece of legislation this year for the better part of probably 6 months, and we've finally come to some agreement with the pawn shop owners. The big issue and the thing that our police forces have been worried about is how they can make sure stolen property that's being, if you will, processed through pawn shops can get back to their rightful owner. There's been a series of contentious discussions with pawn shop owners, making sure that the interests of both the pawn shops and property owners are protected, and our police force can do their job to protect the public interest in private property.
Is likely to pass?
We do think it's likely to pass. Like I said, we've come to some compromise to make sure pawn shops can continue to operate and collect merchandise, but at the same token, make sure that if we know something is stolen, police officers can go in, work with the rightful owners, prosecute folks who have been fencing stolen goods through the pawn shops.
One of the hottest issues of last year's session was the grandma laws, the laws that allow the public access to what their lawmakers are doing. They're talking about it again on Capitol Hill. What's the latest?
I think the legislature is trying to right its wrong from last year. There was certainly a lot of backlash from House Bill 477, which was the bill that was restricting access to public records. This year, Representative John Dougal's working on a piece of legislation to hopefully provide more access to public records. He's looking at doing a state-sponsored website where local governments, special districts, and counties can put their information on the state-sponsored website. So if anyone has a question about a public meeting, public minutes, land use ordinances or documents, rules or procedures of a city or town anywhere in the state of Utah, they can go on this one website and find all that information. So that bill's just getting out of draft form, will be introduced to the House for consideration likely early next week.
Rather interesting piece of legislation that surfaced would allow cities and counties to declare eminent domain over federal lands in Utah. Explain this bill.
There has been a deep concern about how much property the federal government owns in the state of Utah, and several of our rural legislators have been trying to figure out a way to get that property back into the hands of private property owners so that it can go on the tax rolls and there could be more revenue for local governments through taxing of that property. Several pieces of legislation dealing with ways in which the state could condemn that property and then put it up for sale for private ownership, most of which will be likely challenged by the federal government. There's big concerns with that. However, on eminent domain legislation, there is a small piece of eminent domain legislation local governments are working on that will really allow for the connectivity of our trails. And what that does is essentially allow us to condemn on small segments of trails to connect major trail corridors in our community, such as the Bonneville Shoreline Trail that runs through literally 12 or 15 communities. And there are small segments that we haven't been able to complete. So this will allow us the ability to justly compensate landowners and connect those trails.
And that's not likely to be as controversial as the other bills or end up in court.
We hope not. We've worked with many of the interested parties, including the Property Rights Coalition, the state's property ombudsman that looks at eminent domain proceedings, and we have relative buy-off from everybody involved. So we're hoping that moves smoothly. It's just been drafted as well, and it will be introduced for consideration on Monday of next week.
Another bill that's of interest, I know, along the Wasatch Front, especially Salt Lake City and even St. George in Washington County, the billboards issue, control of those bright electronic signs. What's the latest?
The latest is negotiations continue. It passed out of committee, as I mentioned in our last update last week. The sponsor of the bill has just really held on to the bill, trying to encourage the parties to come to some sort of an agreement on how to handle regulation of billboards. I think there is relative recognition that local governments do have a role in regulating things in their community. So it's just trying to strike that balance as to when we can regulate the conversion of billboards and when we shouldn't be able to. It seems like that delineation of regulation is really falling on probably allow for conversions fairly easily on freeways and major corridors, but in residential neighborhoods and on our surface streets, give local governments far more authority to regulate the conversion of those signs from paper to digital face billboards.
Now, if some citizens want more information on what's going on Capitol Hill, where certain bills are, what should they do?
The easiest place for city-specific information is go to our website, which is ulct.org. Also, as I mentioned last week, the state has a great website where they can find information on all the legislation, roughly 1,000 bills this year, and that's le.utah.gov.
And it always helps to contact your legislator, too, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, this is a very friendly government process. It's one of the most accessible legislatures in the nation, so please make sure you're getting in contact with your legislator, expressing your concerns, comments, and feelings related to legislation that's taking place this year.
Well, Lincoln, thank you very much again for your information. And we'll be back again next week with more of your weekly legislative headlines from the Utah League of Cities and Towns.